Welcome to On the Contrary by IDR. In this podcast series, we try to hold space for difficult conversations and then also make space to ask questions that we think people would like to have more nuanced answers to. And today, what we're asking is what does it take to stay human in a tech-first world? I think you know better than anybody else that our lives are lived increasingly online. And so whether it's at work, whether it's at home, I think whether it's even in our own minds, from burnout to the anxiety that comes with the algorithm, we're told often to unplug. And I think what we're wondering is there a better way to design like the systems and the tech that we're using so that the burden of unplugging isn't on the individual alone? And then, so joining us today, we have Grace Clapham.
Yes, that's
Okay,
right.
thank you. A tech humanist, an innovation strategist, and the founder of the Worth Club. Grace has worked inside big tech, co-created programs for Meta and the UN Foundation, and now helps institutions rethink how we build platforms, leadership, and economies so that they reflect not just speed and scale, but also worth. Grace, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I think let's start with like technology shaping the fabric of our lives. Not just how we work, but how we think, how we connect, how we define success. A lot of the times, how we define ourselves. So having worked at the heart of like big tech and also worked outside of it, what shifts when we move, do you think, from designing for attention to designing for belonging?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to add to that question around, not just belonging, but designing for value, like, true value that creates positive and, reciprocal sort of value for ourselves, for the people around us, for the communities, for the society, and for the world at large, right? What we would probably, or what some people may say, human flourishing. So I think, belonging is essential. We as humans want to belong, and it's kind of been the backbone of and the fabric of society. So there is an innate, in a way, need for humans to feel a sense of belonging. But I think when we take it from a lens of like, how do we move from just algorithms to belonging or value, it's really looking at how are we designing for, humans instead of just designing for vanity metrics, right? Instead of just likes or shares or, reposts or followers, those sort of things. Like, I think we need to start thinking about what is the value that this product or this platform or this tool brings to an individual that has deeper impact and deeper meaning. For example, some things could be like, how are we driving meaning? How are we driving meaningful conversations? How are we driving and co-creating, meaningful engagements and interactions with those that are on the platform? And so therefore it creates more of a ripple effect.
And could you explain, do you have an example? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of products right now are designed from the people who are in the organization, and not often designed with the people who we want to be serving. And often products are then designed with the intention of, okay, I want to build this to monetize and scale. And that's not a bad thing, right? Like, we need to be able to sustain ourselves. But often we're driven because VCs are funding the platform, or, investors are wanting to see a certain hockey stick growth, right? And I think instead we need to start thinking, okay, what is the need? Where is the gap? Going back to what we should be is looking at what problem are we trying to solve, and bringing the humans, the individuals, the communities around us at the start of that product design, right? So that we're co-creating versus just building something for, without thinking of the others around us. I'm not saying this is worth-centered leadership, but I think what we're seeing now is a movement of people wanting to build products with more purpose and with more intention and with more consciousness. But I just want to emphasize that I think worth-centered leadership is about how one leads right? So if we're leading from that place of worth, we aren't validating ourselves through what our, what the people around us think, right? Or what the media thinks about us. And so when we're coming from that place, we're then looking at it as like, am I designing this with purpose and with intention? Am I designing this for value, or am I designing this for extraction?
I think I have to follow this up with you. Talk about worth-centered leadership.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is, and then how that ties into using products for good, or designing them?
So worth-centered leadership is a framework I'm still work in progress building. What it is really, what if a leader was leading from a place of inherent self-worth versus from a place of self-esteem, right? So we're not leading from a place of external validation and ego. We're leading from our inherent worth. And so, I've got my little framework here, so I'm going to look at my notes a little. But, it's like the bigger question is, does this or does this not enable human flourishing or societal flourishing, right? Versus does this scale? So right now, my framework is, I'm breaking down W for worth beyond metrics, but really like the value. What is the value we're creating? Why are we creating it? Who are we creating it for? What is the impact that we want to have? Then it's like O for ownership of story. So really each one owning our story and being okay with our story and embracing our story and letting our individual selves kind of shine in the story, reclaiming our narrative. R is around relationships and reciprocity. And it's really about that value flows mutually. And I see it as this infinite loop where we need, to kind of ebb and flow with ourselves, with the rest of society as well. And then T is around transformation and tenacity. It's really, like knowing that change is the only constant. How do we embrace change? How do we thrive in change? How do we remain resilient? And deep change is where, we can really make real big things happen for ourselves and transformation in society at large. And then finally, H is really around looking at life and success holistically. So not just like financial, but looking at social, financial, personal, spiritual, relationship, all the different dimensions of what success could mean for you at this stage or at a stage of life.
Thank you for breaking that down. I think it makes it a lot clearer. I think inherently, when you say worth-centered, you can imagine what that might be, but this paints a much more vivid picture. Do you have an example of any tech that has come from this place, or that you think would be different, if it, like an example tangibly of what that might look like, so that we can help people picture it?
So I think there's a couple of things. One is thinking about designing versus the infinite scroll, right? Maybe thinking about, hang on, or how do we not just have someone on the platform as long as possible, right? But maybe intentionally designing pause options, or like questioning before you post. Again, this is all reimagining, right? But posting, going, are you posting this why are you posting this? Are you posting this for validation? Are you posting this for, because you feel you have to? Versus like, what are my intentions? What are my values, right? So that's an example. One company right now that I've been advising, they're based in the UAE, and it's called PIP, P-I-P-P. And it's still, they've sort of pivoted from a previous name, and they are looking at designing their product where it's connecting creators, brands, and individuals. But they are looking at designing these moments of pause in their app, right? They are looking at designing, like, even, AI integrations, being like, hey, have you taken a minute to, or have you been on the platform too long? Do you want to take a break, right? So we're not trying to get as many eyeballs for as long as possible. That's an example. The other is, I would say, transparency in terms and conditions, or transparency in our privacy and our data, right? I mean, how many times do you go on an app to go, wait, all of a sudden you're like, I need to consent this, or now I need to do this, and there's just no clarity or even knowing how to go into some of these platforms, right? To find those. So ethically designed should be like, while you're onboarding, do you see this? Do you acknowledge this is what, like plain simple terms even, right?
Yeah.
So I think those types of things are things we should consider.
You have said that we need to scale deeply and not just widely.
Yeah.
What does that mean for how we build tech, lead teams, work with communities? What does scaling deep mean?
Yeah, I mean, look, scaling deep, the term came from Tatiana Fraser. And she really talks about, you know, the transformation being systemic and longer term, and I won't do it justice. So, but for me, what scaling deep means is really, again, I think on maybe 3 levels, right? One is I always start with the individual, right? So how do we as an individual scale deeply? And, you know, really that is the foundation of everything, is us ourselves. You know, second is how do we scale within you know, societies or community, and then how do we scale deeply when it comes down to the things that we create that has a ripple effect, right? So it's sort of like these 3 circles, let's say, 3 concentric circles. But to me, scaling deep is I'd rather work with 1,000 people and go really deep in transformation and change, you know, or have a product that really has that deeper impact, right? Versus like 1 million people where then you know, tomorrow maybe they forget about you, or later they move to a better platform, you know, because there's something else, right? So for me, scaling deep is really like, I want my work to leave an imprint and, you know, like a long lasting effect that is generational, right? And that has a ripple effect beyond just a once off or a twice off. And I think about that, whether it's programs, I think about it, whether it's, you know, like products, and really building even the life cycle of a customer into the journey that takes them through different stages of them, you know, their change or their impact, right?
If you could change just one design principle that is embedded into the more dominant tech platforms, what would that be?
You know, many people on these big tech platforms, where if they're coming from emerging markets, right, it's a very different level of understanding. I guess I'd add one other thing, is that I think we're often designing products from a Western perspective versus from the Eastern, and not that, you know, it's East versus West, but I've seen where products are designed from the West to come into Asia, and we're not really taking into context like behavioral, cultural nuances, and, you know, algorithms aren't able to pick a lot of that up because we're still learning, and so I think being able to design locally, like, but stay globally attuned and locally attuned, I think is essential. You know, I think something that at Meta we would do, and I think we need to do more of it, is that when we were supporting community leaders, you know, some of the largest communities were in markets like India or Indonesia. And oftentimes the products that we were designing didn't necessarily work on, say, a 2G phone, right? Or so that's a very simple example, where information that's being shared may work on a 5G phone, but doesn't work on a 2G. I mean, again, that's a very very simplistic way of looking at how do we design for local versus not. You know, I think the other is thinking about behavioral usages in a market like Africa, Indonesia, and India as an example, right? Like the way payments are made in these countries, right? You know, payment gateways are so different. Again, I'm not a payment gateway expert, but, you know, people in Indonesia have GoPay, have, you know, all these different other apps for making payments that some platforms from the US are only taking Stripe or PayPal. Yeah. And that's not how money is, you know, transferred necessarily. Or the other is, you know, taking into consideration like words. So again, like certain local or indigenous words may show up differently algorithmically, or mean something different when it shows up if you just translate to English, right? And that is also because there's so many languages, there's so many, nuances to language, and algorithms right now are just still not at that stage, because a lot of what's being fed is still from the West, right? Because accessibility and all these other things.